The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the ranch house, and a man who owned the land didn't come out to greet it. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching the woman climb down with her trunk in both hands. And the first thing he said to her was, "I didn't ask for damaged goods." Sarah Whitfield set her trunk down in the dirt and lifted her chin so the burn scar along her jaw and neck caught the full light of the afternoon sun. She had learned long ago not to hide it. Hiding only made people stare longer. "I'm the laundress the agency sent," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." The rancher, a broad man with graying temples and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested in months, didn't move from the porch. "The agency sent me a woman who could handle a household. They didn't mention she'd frighten the hands." "I don't frighten easy, Mr. Calloway, and I don't intend to frighten anyone else either. I wash linens. I don't ask to be looked at." Behind her, the driver was already climbing back onto the wagon seat, in a hurry to be gone before the sun dropped. What Caleb Calloway didn't know yet, standing there with his arms crossed and his ranch dying quietly around him, was that the woman he'd just insulted on his own front step would be the reason his land was still standing come next spring. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Montana Territory in the autumn of 1881 was not a forgiving place for a man who had stopped caring whether his cattle lived or died. Caleb Calloway had built Calloway Ranch with his own two hands and his late wife Margaret's steady counsel. And in the 18 months since the fever took her, he had let it slide into ruin one field at a time. The east pasture had gone to weed. Half his herd had wandered off in the spring because no one had mended the fences. His hands had quit one by one. Tired of asking for wages, he was too grief-sunk to remember to pay. Sarah Whitfield had answered an advertisement out of desperation of her own kind. She'd been a seamstress in Denver until a lamp fire took half her face and most of her prospects along with it. Men who might have courted her looked away now. Employers who might have hired her for finer work sent her instead toward the rough edges of the territory, where a scarred woman with steady hands could still find use. The advertisement had said laundress and cook, room and board included. It hadn't said anything about a rancher who looked at her like she was one more burden dropped onto a pile already too heavy to carry. She picked her trunk back up without waiting for help and carried it herself toward the bunkhouse, since no one had shown her where else to go. Behind her, she heard Caleb mutter something to his foreman, a weathered man named Otis who at least had the decency to take his hat off when she passed. "Ma'am," Otis said, "kitchen's around back. I'll show you where you'll be staying." "Thank you." She didn't look toward the porch again. She had learned that lesson years ago, that turning to see whether someone was still staring only confirmed for them that the staring mattered. The room Otis led her to was small but clean, tucked off the kitchen where the housekeeper used to sleep before she'd left along with everyone else. Sarah set her trunk at the foot of the narrow bed and looked around at the bare walls. The single window facing the drying fields, the dust that had settled over everything like a shroud. Ranch used to be something, Otis said, almost apologetic. Before his wife passed. Otis nodded slowly. "You heard about that already. The agency mentioned it, so the household needed a steady hand." She ran her fingers along the windowsill, gathering dust on her fingertips. "I could be a steady hand." That first evening, she cooked supper for the 6 hands who remained, using what she found in the pantry, which wasn't much. Salt pork, dried beans, flour gone slightly stale. She made do, the way she always made do, and when the men sat down to eat, they ate in a hush that told her plainly enough what they thought of her face before any of them said a word. Caleb didn't come to supper. Otis brought a plate out to him where he sat alone in the barn, going over ledgers by lamplight that told him nothing he didn't already know. The ranch was bleeding money. The bank in town had sent 2 letters already that autumn, each one more pointed than the last about the mortgage he'd taken out the year Margaret got sick, hoping a specialist in Helena might save her. The specialist hadn't. The debt remained. Sarah found this out not because anyone told her directly, but because she had spent years learning to read a room the way other people read a book. She saw the letters stacked on the desk when she went in to sweep. She saw the thin cattle in the corral, ribs showing through hide that should have been sleek this time of year. She saw a man so buried in his own grief that he'd stopped noticing the world falling apart around him, brick by brick, fence post by fence post. She understood grief of that particular shape better than most, though hers had taken a different form. The man she'd been engaged to in Denver, a dry goods merchant named Harold Pruitt, had called on her faithfully every Sunday for the better part of the year before the fire took her face. He called on her exactly once after, standing stiffly in her sister's parlor with his hat in his hands, unable to look at her directly for the full 10 minutes he stayed. He did not break the engagement outright. He simply stopped calling, and after 3 weeks of silence, Sarah had written him a short letter releasing him from any obligation, sparing them both the indignity of pretending otherwise. She had not cried over Harold Pruitt in a long while, but she had never forgotten the particular cruelty of being loved conditionally, loved only so long as she remained pleasant to look at. It was that memory, more than any abstract notion of charity, that made her patient with a grieving rancher who could not yet see past his own sorrow. She knew what it cost a person to keep functioning while carrying a wound the world insisted on treating as disqualifying. On her third morning, she rose before dawn, same as always, and instead of going straight to the wash basins, she walked the fence line nearest the house. Whole sections had rotted through. Cattle could wander wherever they pleased, which explained why half the herd Otis mentioned was probably 3 counties over by now, eating someone else's grass for free. She said nothing about it to Caleb. She simply mentioned it to Otis over breakfast, quiet enough that the other hands didn't hear. That west fence needs mending before winter, or you'll lose what's left of the herd to the Hendricks land. Otis raised an eyebrow. That's not laundry work, ma'am. No, but I grew up on a farm in Missouri before Denver. I know what a broken fence costs a man, even if he doesn't. Caleb overheard this exchange from the doorway, where he'd come looking for coffee he didn't particularly want, mostly an excuse to be somewhere other than the empty house. He said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly, the way ice shifts before it cracks. You know cattle, Miss Whitfield? She turned to face him fully, unashamed, the scarred side of her jaw catching the morning light, same as the smooth side. I know a ranch dying of neglect when I see one, Mr. Calloway. I know a man too deep in his own sorrow to notice his own land is telling him the same thing his hands have been too afraid to say. The kitchen went very quiet. Otis suddenly found something urgent to attend to near the stove. Caleb's jaw tightened. You were hired to wash linens. I was hired because your household needed a steady hand. I'm giving you one. Whether you use it is your business. She turned back to the stove, ending the conversation on her own terms, which was not something anyone at Calloway Ranch had done to Caleb Calloway in a very long time. He left without his coffee. That first week settled into a rhythm neither of them named out loud. Sarah rose before the others and had bread rising by the time the hands stumbled in for breakfast. She scrubbed floors that hadn't seen proper attention since Margaret's illness had begun eating away at the household's order well before it took her life. She patched shirts and mended trousers with a needle so quick and neat that Otis remarked one evening she could have made a fortune as a seamstress in any city in the country. I did, Sarah said simply, not elaborating further, and Otis had the good sense not to press. She learned the names of the 6 remaining hands within her first 3 days, something none of them had expected from a woman most of them assumed would keep to the kitchen and nowhere else. Jim Poole, a lanky young man, barely 20, who missed his mother's cooking something fierce. Old Ezra, who'd worked the ranch since before Caleb had bought it and remembered Margaret as a bride arriving the same way Sarah had, uncertain and far from home. 2 brothers, Dutch and Aaron Miller, quiet men who did their work without complaint and ate whatever was put in front of them. A wiry cattleman named Frank who drifted in from Wyoming the winter before and stayed on because the pay, when it came, was decent. And Otis himself, who ran the daily operations in Caleb's increasing absence of mind, if not body. Sarah watched them all, learned their habits, understood within a week which of them needed encouragement and which needed nothing but a full plate and left in peace. It was, she realized, not so different from managing a household of difficult customers back in Denver, except here the stakes were a man's entire livelihood rather than the fit of a dress. The weeks that followed took on a shape neither of them had planned for. Sarah kept the house running with a precision that made even the hardened ranch hands sit up straighter at meals. She mended clothes that had gone unmended for a year. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until the wood grain showed through years of grime. And slowly, carefully, without ever asking permission, she began fixing what she could of the ranch itself. She couldn't mend fences with her own hands, not the heavy timber work that took 2 strong men and a full day's labor, but she could organize. She made lists. She figured out, from an old ledger she found half buried in Margaret's sewing basket, which fields had once rotated, which crops, which pastures had rested, and which had been overgrazed into dust. She left the lists on Caleb's desk without comment, and for 2 weeks he ignored them entirely, too proud or too broken to admit that a laundress understood his own land better than he currently did. It was Otis who finally pushed him toward paying attention, in the quiet way an old foreman pushes a stubborn man toward sense. "She's not wrong, boss," Otis said one evening, the two of them sharing a smoke on the porch steps after the hands had turned in. "About the west pasture. About the rotation. Margaret used to talk about doing the same thing, you remember? Before she got sick." Caleb's throat worked. He didn't answer for a long moment. "Margaret's not here to talk about it anymore." "No, but the woman in your kitchen is, and she's not asking for your gratitude, Caleb. She's just doing the work nobody else has the sense to do." Caleb said nothing, but the next morning he picked up the list from his desk and read them properly for the first time. He didn't thank her for it. That wasn't in him yet, not that early on. But he began riding out to the pastures she'd marked as failing, walking the fence lines himself, counting cattle with an attention he hadn't given the herd in over a year. Sarah noticed the change from the kitchen window and said nothing, understanding that some men needed to believe an idea was their own before they could act on it, and she had no interest in taking credit where the work itself was reward enough. The first real conversation between them happened 3 weeks after her arrival, on a cold evening when Sarah found Caleb in the barn long after the other hands had gone to bed. He wasn't working. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at nothing, a bottle of whiskey beside him that was more full than empty, which told her he hadn't come out here to drown himself, just to be alone with the silence. She almost turned back. Almost. But something in the slump of his shoulders reminded her of her own worst nights after the fire. The ones where she'd sat alone in a rented room in Denver, convinced that her life, as she'd known it, was over and nothing worth having remained. "You'll catch your death out here," she said instead of leaving. Caleb didn't look up. "Wouldn't be the worst thing." "No," she agreed, coming to stand near him, not too close. "But it wouldn't be the best thing either, and your ranch needs you breathing more than it needs you noble." He let out something that might have been a laugh, if a laugh could sound that hollow. "You've got opinions for a woman hired to do laundry. I've got eyes, Mr. Calloway. I see a man who built something with his own hands and let it fall to ruin because he couldn't bear to look at it without seeing his wife standing in the doorway." Caleb's head snapped up at that, sharp and raw. For a moment she thought she'd gone too far, that he would order her off the ranch that very night. But instead something in his face crumbled, just slightly, the careful control he'd held for 18 months finally cracking under the weight of being seen. "She used to stand right there," he said quietly, gesturing toward the barn door. "Every morning. Bring me coffee before I'd even finished the first chore. Called it foolish, walking all that way just to bring a man his coffee, but she did it every day for 9 years. His voice broke. "I can't walk past that spot without seeing her." Sarah sat down on a hay bale near him, not touching, giving him the same respect for his grief that she wished people had given her scars. "I lost my face in a fire 2 years back," she said. "Not my life, just the face people used to look at with any kindness. And for a long while I thought that meant I'd lost everything worth having too. My prospects, my future, any chance at being seen as something other than damaged." Caleb studied her then, really studied her, in a way no one at the ranch had bothered to since her arrival. Not staring at the scar the way strangers did, cataloging the damage, but looking at the whole of her, weighing what she'd said. "What changed your mind?" Nothing changed my mind, she admitted. I just got tired of waiting to feel whole again before I let myself live. I decided living had to come first, and the feeling whole part could catch up whenever it was ready, if it ever was. She looked at him directly. Your ranch is dying, Mr. Calloway, same as I was dying 2 years ago. Not because Margaret's gone, because you've decided nothing matters until the grief lifts, and grief doesn't lift on anybody's schedule but its own. He was quiet a long time. The barn creaked around them, settling in the cold. Somewhere out in the dark a coyote called, and another answered. Why do you care? He finally asked. You've been here 3 weeks. You could leave tomorrow and never think of this place again. I could, she agreed. But I've spent 2 years being told my worth. End of the day, my face changed. I don't intend to spend the rest of my life proving people right about that. If I can help a ranch stand back up on its feet and help a man remember he's still got reasons to stand on his own, then that's worth doing, whether anyone thanks me for it or not. Caleb didn't say anything else that night, but he didn't send her away either. And the next morning, for the first time in 18 months, he rode out to the west pasture with tools in hand and began mending fence himself. Word spread through the county the way it always does in small places, quiet at first, and then all at once. The scarred laundress at Calloway Ranch had the rancher up before dawn again, working his own land like a man who remembered why he'd built it. So the talk was kind. Much of it wasn't. At the mercantile in town, a cluster of ranch wives took particular pleasure in speculating. Among them was Louisa Hartford, the banker's wife, whose husband held Caleb's mortgage and whose opinion of Sarah Whitfield had curdled the moment she laid eyes on her. A laundress with a face like that, giving orders to Caleb Calloway like she owns the place. Louisa said to anyone who'd listen, loud enough that she clearly intended Sarah to hear it the one time their paths crossed near the dry goods counter. I don't know what kind of woman thinks she can walk onto a man's land and start rearranging his whole life. Some might call that forward. I'd call it shameless, especially with that face of hers on display for all to see. Sarah kept her chin up and her hands steady around the flour sack she was purchasing, the way she'd trained herself to do through 2 years of exactly this kind of cruelty. The flour, please, if you don't mind my shameless face standing near your counter a moment longer. The shopkeeper, embarrassed, hurried to complete the sale. Louisa's friends tittered behind gloved hands. Sarah walked out with her purchase and her dignity both intact, though her hands trembled slightly on the ride back to the ranch, the old wound of being looked at and found wanting reopening same as it always did. She didn't cry until she was well past the edge of town, alone on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her hands, letting the horse find its own way home while she let the tears fall where no one could see them and call her weak for it. She had promised herself, standing in the ashes of her old life 2 years before, that she would never again let another person's cruelty decide how she carried herself. But promises made in one moment of clarity had a way of costing more than expected when tested in another. By the time the ranch house came into view, she had wiped her face clean and set her shoulders straight again. Whatever she felt privately, she would not carry it into Caleb's kitchen where 6 hungry men expected their supper on time. Caleb heard about the encounter from Otis before Sarah said a word of it herself, and something in him went tight and cold in a way none of the hands had seen since before Margaret's illness. He found Sarah in the kitchen that evening, scrubbing a pot with more force than the pot required. Otis told me what happened in town. It's nothing I haven't heard before, Mr. Calloway. No need to trouble yourself. It's my business when someone insults a woman under my roof. His voice was low, controlled, but there was iron underneath it that hadn't been there in a long while. Louisa Hartford's opinion of you means less than the dirt under my boots, and if she or anyone else in this county has something to say about the way you've brought this ranch back from the edge of ruin, they can say it to my face. Sarah set the pot down, surprised by the fierceness in him. You don't need to defend me. Maybe not, but I intend to anyway. He met her eyes, and something passed between them that neither one named out loud. You saved this ranch, Sarah, not just the fences and the cattle rotation. You saved something in me I thought the fever had buried along with Margaret. I won't stand by while this county treats you like you're less than what you are. She felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with shame this time. "And what am I in your accounting, Mr. Calloway?" "The steadiest hand this ranch has ever known," he said quietly. "And a woman I've come to respect more than I know how to say properly." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night. Both too raw, too uncertain of what they were building to rush toward something neither fully understood yet. But something had shifted, quiet and undeniable, the way the first frost shifts a field before anyone notices winter has properly arrived. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. There was a barn dance in town 2 weeks later, the last of the season before the weather turned too hard for anyone to travel the distances such gatherings required. Otis convinced Caleb to attend, arguing that the hands deserved an evening off after the work they'd put into the herd, and Caleb, in turn, found himself asking Sarah if she might like to come along, an invitation that surprised them both in its plainness. Sarah nearly refused. She had attended exactly one such gathering since the fire, a church social in Denver, where she'd spent the whole evening standing near the refreshment table while conversations dried up whenever she approached. But something in the way Caleb asked, without any trace of obligation or pity, made her reconsider. "I'll come," she said, "but I won't apologize for my face to anyone who has an opinion about it." "Wouldn't expect you to," Caleb said. The dance was held in the Grange hall, lanterns strung along the rafters, a trio of local men working through reels and waltzes with more enthusiasm than polish. Sarah wore her one good dress, dark green wool that had survived the move from Denver more or less intact, and she walked in on Caleb's arm with her chin lifted the same way she carried herself every single day at the ranch. The whispering started almost immediately. She had expected that. What she had not expected was Caleb's response to it, steady and immovable, steering her toward the dance floor rather than away from the attention, as if daring anyone in the room to say something to her face that they'd only been willing to say behind her back. A rancher named Dell Ashford, a heavy-set man who ran cattle 2 valleys over and had long coveted the water rights of the long Calloway land, made the mistake of saying something anyway, loud enough for half the hall to hear over the fiddle music. "Didn't expect you to bring your housekeeper to a proper dance, Calloway. Didn't realize standards had fallen quite that far." The music did not stop, but several couples near them slowed, aware something had shifted in the room. Caleb's hand tightened briefly on Sarah's, not in warning to her, but as if bracing himself. "Dell," Caleb said, his voice carrying without being raised, "you'll apologize to Miss Whitfield, or you'll take this conversation outside where I won't have to mind my manners on account of the ladies present." Dell's face reddened, caught between his own pride and the plain fact that Caleb Calloway, even grieving and diminished as he'd been the past 18 months, was not a man most people in the valley cared to cross directly. "No offense meant," he muttered finally, which was as close to an apology as the moment was going to produce. "Offense was taken regardless," Caleb said. "See that it doesn't happen again." He led Sarah back onto the floor after that, and though her hands trembled slightly with the aftermath of being discussed so openly, she found herself grateful in a way she hadn't expected, not for being defended exactly, but for being seen as someone worth defending in the first place. It had been a very long time since anyone had done that for her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once the music had swallowed them back into its rhythm. "I know," Caleb said, echoing her own words back to her from weeks before. "I did it anyway." October gave way to a hard November, and the work of the ranch only grew heavier as the days shortened and the temperature dropped. Sarah found herself doing more than any laundress had ever been asked to do, not because Caleb demanded it of her, but because she had come to care whether the herd survived the winter, whether the hands had enough to eat, whether the man she'd once thought incapable of standing up straight again might yet find his footing. She taught herself to help with the branding that came late that year, work usually left entirely to men. And though Otis protested at first that it wasn't fit work for a woman, he stopped protesting once he saw how steady her hands were with a rope, how calm she kept the younger cattle simply by speaking low, and even the way she once must have calmed a customer unhappy with a dress fitting. Caleb watched her from across the corral one afternoon, covered in dust and laughing at something Jim Poole had said, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the day they buried Margaret beneath the cottonwood on the hill. It frightened him, that feeling. It felt like betrayal. Though he could not have said exactly who he thought he was betraying, Margaret or the version of himself that had decided grief was the only honest way left to live. He mentioned this, haltingly, to Otis one evening as they finished the last of the evening chores. "Feels wrong," he admitted. "Feeling anything but tired and sad. Feels like I'm forgetting her." Otis, who had known Caleb since he was a boy following his own father around this same ranch, set down his tools and looked at him steadily. "Margaret loved you feeling alive, Caleb. Not half dead and going through motions. You think she'd want this?" He gestured at the ranch around them, healthier now than it had been in 2 years, but Caleb understood he meant more than the land. "You think she'd want you punishing yourself for the rest of your days because the fever took her instead of you?" Caleb didn't answer, but the words settled into him the way seeds settle into soil after a long drought, waiting for the right conditions to finally take root. The real test came in late November, when an early blizzard swept down from the mountains without warning, threatening the newly mended fences and the herd Caleb had spent 2 months nursing back toward health. Sarah worked alongside the hands through the worst of it, hauling feed, breaking ice on the water troughs, doing work no laundress had ever been asked to do, and doing it without complaint because the alternative was watching everything they'd rebuilt collapse in a single night. It was during the worst of the storm that Caleb's horse spooked near the eastern fence line, throwing him hard against a post before bolting into the whiteout. Otis found him an hour later, unconscious and half-buried in drifting snow, and it was Sarah who sat up with him 3 nights straight while the doctor from town, delayed by the storm, finally arrived to set his broken arm and check for worse injuries beneath the bruising. She did not sleep those 3 nights, not properly. She sponged his forehead when the fever from exposure threatened to take hold. She spoke to him in the low, even voice she'd learned worked on frightened cattle, telling him about nothing in particular about the ranch, about the way the snow had settled over the fields like a blanket finally pulled up over a restless child. She did not know if he heard any of it, but she kept talking anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence in a sick room had a way of inviting the worst kind of thoughts. "You didn't have to sit up with me," Caleb said. Once he was well enough to speak, his arm bound tight against his chest, his face pale from the ordeal. "I know," Sarah said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. "I did it anyway." "Why?" She set the mending aside, finally meeting his eyes. "Because somewhere in these last 2 months, Caleb Calloway, I stopped seeing you as an employer and started seeing you as someone worth caring whether he lived or died. I don't rightly know when that happened. I only know it did." Caleb reached for her hand with his good arm, and this time neither of them pulled away. "Sarah, I've spent 18 months believing nothing good could come to a man who let his own grief nearly bury a ranch his wife loved. I didn't think I deserved to feel anything again, let alone this." "Grief doesn't erase a man's worth," Sarah said softly. "Same as a scar doesn't erase a woman's. We're both of us just people who've been broken and are figuring out how to stand up straight again. Maybe we do a better job of it standing up together." He brought her hand to his lips, gentle despite his injury, and for the first time since Margaret's passing, Caleb Calloway let himself believe that a future existed on the other side of his grief, one he hadn't thought himself allowed to want. Were the courtship, once it became plain enough that even the hands stopped pretending not to notice, reached town within the week. Louisa Hartford had opinions about that too, delivered this time to her husband over supper, insisting that a scarred laundress marrying into a respectable ranching family would be a scandal the whole valley would remember for years. Her husband, who held the mortgage and had watched the payments arrive on time for the first time in over a year, was considerably less troubled by the arrangement than his wife. "The Calloway account is current for the first time since his wife passed," Mr. Hartford said mildly. "I don't much care who's responsible for that, Louisa, so long as it stays that way." Louisa did not take the rebuke well, but she took it, and her public commentary on the matter grew notably quieter after that, though it never entirely disappeared. There would always be those in the valley who looked at Sarah's scar before they looked at anything else about her. She had made her peace with that reality long before she ever arrived at Calloway Ranch, and she did not intend to let it cost her a future she had not expected to find. By the time spring arrived, Calloway Ranch bore little resemblance to the dying operation Sarah had first walked onto. The herd had doubled, healthy and fat, on properly rotated pasture. The fences stood true along every boundary line. The hands who'd once quit in frustration had been joined by 3 new men drawn by word of a ranch finally worth working for again. Otis, watching the transformation from the vantage point of 30 years working the same land, remarked to Ezra one evening that he'd never seen anything like it. "Wasn't the fences that saved this place," he said. "Wasn't the cattle rotation neither, though Lord knows that helped. It was her deciding Caleb was worth saving before he'd decided it himself." Ezra, who remembered Margaret well enough to know she would have approved, only nodded and said nothing more. Dell Ashford made one final attempt that spring to press his old claim on the water rights, arriving at the ranch unannounced with papers drawn up by a lawyer in Helena, insisting that a survey done years before showed the Eastern Creek bed belonged rightfully to his own land. Caleb met in the yard, Sarah standing a few steps behind with a rifle she had learned to handle over the winter resting easily in the crook of her arm, not raised, not threatening, simply present. "That survey was settled 20 years ago, Dell, and you know it," Caleb said. "You're trying your luck because you think a man distracted by grief won't notice you sniffing around his boundary lines again." "Times change," Dell said, though his eyes kept drifting toward Sarah and the rifle she held with such unbothered ease. "Man in your position might welcome an offer for the eastern section. Fair price. More than fair, considering the state this place was in not so long ago." "The state of this place is none of your concern," Sarah said before Caleb could answer, stepping forward enough to make her presence in the conversation plain. "And the water rights aren't for sale, Mr. Ashford, fair price or otherwise. I'd suggest you take your papers back to Helena and save yourself the ride out here next time." Dell looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, weighing whether a scarred laundress turned rancher's intended wife was worth the trouble of pressing further. Whatever he decided, he folded the papers back into his coat without another word and rode off, and he did not return to press the matter again, not that spring nor any spring after. "You didn't have to step in," Caleb said once the dust from Dell's departure had settled. "I know," Sarah said, and this time it was her voice that carried the echo of their shared understanding. "I did it anyway." Spring brought calving season, the hardest and most rewarding stretch of the ranching year, and Sarah found herself in the barn at all hours right alongside the hands, holding lanterns, fetching water, once even helping pull a breech calf into the world with her own 2 hands, while Caleb held the mother steady and Otis shouted instructions from the stall door. When the calf finally slid free, wet and trembling and alive against every expectation the difficult birth had suggested, Sarah found herself crying without quite understanding why, and Caleb, exhausted and streaked with mud and blood, pulled her close without caring who saw. "That's the same look Margaret used to get," Otis said quietly to Ezra, watching from a respectful distance. "Same exact look every calving season, like the whole world had just been born new again." In the valley, the story of the scarred laundress who'd saved a grieving rancher's land had traveled from mouth to mouth until even Louisa Hartford found herself forced into a grudging silence. Since the mortgage her own husband held against Calloway Ranch had been paid in full 2 months ahead of schedule, the bank letters that once threatened ruin now sitting forgotten in a drawer. Louisa's daughter, a quiet girl of 14 named Prudence, had watched her mother's cruelty towards Sarah with a growing discomfort she finally voiced one afternoon when the 2 women crossed paths again at the mercantile, this time with no crowd of gossiping wives to embolden anyone's meanness. Prudence approached Sarah directly while her mother was occupied at the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for what my mother said to you last fall," the girl said. "I've thought about it since. It wasn't right what she said about your face." Sarah, caught off guard by the unprompted kindness, knelt slightly to meet the girl's eyes properly. "That's a brave thing to say, Prudence, especially with your mother close by. Thank you for it. Does it hurt?" Prudence asked, then flushed, embarrassed by her own bluntness. "I didn't mean. I only wondered." "It did once," Sarah said honestly. "Now it's mostly just a part of me, same as the color of my eyes or the shape of my hands. People make it into something more than that, but it never was, not really." Prudence considered this with the particular seriousness of a girl on the edge of womanhood, still forming her own opinions about which of her mother's views she intended to carry forward and which she meant to leave behind. "I hope when I'm grown I'm as unbothered by what people say as you seem to be." "I'm bothered plenty," Sarah admitted. "I've just learned not to let it decide anything important." The girl smiled, quick and genuine, before her mother called her back to the counter, and Sarah watched her go with a small, unexpected warmth settling in her chest, the sense that perhaps the Valley's opinion of her was not so fixed and unchangeable as Louisa Hartford liked to pretend. Caleb married Sarah Whitfield on a clear April morning beneath the old cottonwood near the house, with Otis standing witness and the hands who'd stayed through the worst of the winter gathered in their Sunday best. Sarah wore no veil to hide her scar. She walked toward Caleb with her chin lifted the same way she'd carried herself since the day she arrived, unashamed and unbroken. And when Caleb looked at her, he looked at her whole. The ceremony was simple, performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the valley that same week, a fortunate coincidence that Sarah privately thought Margaret herself might have arranged if such things were possible. Ezra cried openly during the vows, unashamed of it in front of the younger hands, and Jim Poole presented the couple with a hand-carved wooden box he'd spent the better part of a month working on in secret, awkward in his shyness, but earnest in his affection for two people who'd given the whole ranch a reason to hope again. To everyone's surprise, Prudence Hartford appeared at the edge of the small gathering partway through the ceremony, having walked the better part of 2 miles on her own without her mother's knowledge or permission. She stood quietly near the fence, unwilling to intrude further, but when Sarah caught sight of her afterward, she crossed the yard at once and drew the girl into the celebration without a moment's hesitation. "I didn't want you to think nobody in town wished you well," Prudence said, flushed from the walk and the boldness of having made it. "I know my mother's said terrible things. I wanted you to know not everybody agrees with her." "You've made my wedding day better for having come," Sarah said, and meant it entirely. "Thank you, Prudence." The girl stayed through the small supper that followed, and Otis, ever practical, arranged for one of the hands to drive her home before dark so her walk back wouldn't worry her mother into some fresh grievance. Sarah watched her go with the same warmth she'd felt at the mercantile weeks before, the quiet certainty that kindness had a way of spreading even in places that seemed, on the surface, entirely hostile to it. Caleb noticed the exchange and drew Sarah close once the wagon had disappeared down the road. "Seems you've made an admirer. Seems the Valley's got more decent people in it than Louisa Hartford would have anybody believe," Sarah said. "Just took some patience to find them." "You gave me back my land," Caleb said quietly, as the small gathering looked on. "But more than that, you gave me back myself." "We gave each other something," Sarah answered. "That's how I intend for this to work, Caleb. Not one of us saving the other, but both of us building something neither could have built alone." That evening, after the small celebration had wound down and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet of a place finally at peace with itself, Sarah stood on the porch where she'd first set down her trunk 7 months before. Caleb came to stand beside her, his arm no longer bound, the bruises long since faded, and together they looked out over land that had nearly been lost and was now, against every expectation either of them had carried into that first cold afternoon, thriving. "They called you damaged goods," Caleb said. "The whole county did, one way or another." "They were wrong," Sarah said simply. "And so was I, thinking my worth had burned away with my face." Turns out a person's value was never in how they looked to strangers passing through town. It was always in what they were willing to build, and who they were willing to build it with. Caleb pulled her close, and Sarah leaned into him without hesitation, without the old instinct to shrink from being seen. The valley stretched out before them in the fading light. Cattle grazing peacefully on grass that had nearly been lost to neglect, fences standing true against a sky finally clear of storm. Years later, when the ranch had grown to be one of the most prosperous in the county, and their own children ran barefoot through fields, Sarah had once walked alone, counting rotted fence posts. She would tell the story of that first afternoon to anyone who asked how she and Caleb had found each other. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she told most things. A wagon that stopped in front of a dying ranch. A man, too, buried in grief to see what stood in front of him. A woman, too, scarred by the world's cruelty to expect anything but more of the same. Prudence Hartford grew into a frequent visitor at Calloway Ranch over the years that followed, arriving on weekends to help with whatever needed doing and staying long past supper more often than her mother entirely approved of. She was there the day the first of Sarah and Caleb's children learned to walk, there again years later when Otis, gray and slower but still stubbornly working, finally handed his foreman's duties over to Jim Poole. Grown from a lanky boy, missing his mother's cooking into a capable man, Sarah had watched come in his own the same way she'd watched the ranch itself transform. Louisa Hartford never fully softened, not in any way she would have admitted aloud, but she stopped speaking against Sarah in public, whether from genuine change of heart or simple recognition that the valley's opinion had shifted decisively against her on the matter. Sarah did not need her approval by then. She had built something sturdier than any one woman's good opinion, a home and a family and a place in the valley that no amount of old cruelty could unmake. And somewhere in the space between those two broken people, something had grown that neither of them had thought themselves capable of finding again. Not despite what they had lost, but because of what they had both been willing to rebuild. She would tell it to her own daughter one evening years later, the girl tracing a curious finger along the faded scar at her mother's jaw, asking without any of the cruelty the valley had once shown, only a child's plain curiosity about the shape of her mother's history. "Did it hurt, Mama?" "It did once," Sarah told her, the same answer she'd given Prudence so many years before, worn smooth now with repetition and truth in equal measure. "But your papa taught me something about hurt, same as I taught him. It doesn't have to be the last word on who a person is. It's just one part of a much longer story." "What's the rest of the story?" Sarah looked out the window at the ranch stretching green and prosperous toward the mountains, at Caleb walking the fence line with their son trailing behind him, at the life the two of them had built from the wreckage the world had left them both standing in. "The rest of the story," she said, "is that two broken people decided they'd rather build something together than stay broken apart. That's the whole of it, really. Everything else is just the details." Her daughter considered this with the same seriousness Prudence Hartford had once shown at the mercantile counter, still young enough to take her mother's words as simple fact rather than hard-won wisdom. "I think that's a good story, Mama." "So do I," Sarah said, and pulled the girl close against her side, watching the last of the daylight settle golden warm across the valley that had once called her nothing but damaged goods, and had since become, in every way that mattered, entirely and unmistakably home. It was, Sarah thought, standing on that porch on her wedding night with Caleb's arm around her and the whole valley quiet and green before them. Exactly the home she hadn't known she was looking for, built not despite what the world had called her, but because she had refused to let their cruelty decide what she was capable of giving. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.